In speech and in hearing be present with us, O Lord, that your ancient word might be made new to us this day. Amen. Once upon a time there was a sick man who, as he was lying on his deathbed, sent for an old friend from whom he was estranged. They had argued many years previously and had never reconciled. And over the course of many intervening years, each had nursed feelings of anger and betrayal that only seemed to magnify with the passage of time. But now, with eternity lying before him, the sick man made overtures of reconciliation. The estranged friend came and they talked, and ultimately the two shook hands in a gesture of forgiveness and renewed relationship. As the friend left the room, however, the sick man rallied enough strength to say, "Remember, though, if I get better, the old argument still stands." Now that's just a story, a little parable about the frailty of human nature. But it speaks an unfortunate truth, doesn't it? It speaks to the fact that we can easily observe within ourselves or within others a tendency to want to hold on to feelings of moral superiority if we think we're in the right and someone else is in the wrong. No matter how small or insignificant the perceived transgression may be in the great scheme of things, that feeling of smug self-satisfaction is indeed one reward for hanging on to real or imagined slights. And you know, when it comes to the church, it seems that relationship issues become even more challenging. And that, I think, relates to the fact that we've mistakenly perpetuated a culture of nice. We think that the gospel has something to do with being nice to everyone. And that has translated into not confronting the conflict that inevitably surfaces in every human relationship, and organizational relationships in particular. We seem to be more comfortable quietly and passively tolerating the elephant in the room, and God help the person who names it. But interestingly, Jesus doesn't call us to be nice. Jesus calls us to be honest. There's a difference. Honesty and forgiveness and reconciliation, if we choose to pay attention to Jesus at all, together form a cornerstone of the Christian life. And I think all of us would agree, probably one of the most difficult to put into practice because it involves emotional risk. Healthy relationships take time and effort. And let's face it, sometimes it feels like the will and the energy to address a problem just aren't at our fingertips when we need or want them to be. What happens, though, when we allow issues and resentments to build up without resolution? I think we all know the answer to that. It's not an intellectual stretch to know that people routinely come to unfounded conclusions and then happily paint themselves into corners of judgment and unforgiveness from which they can't easily escape. Well, today's gospel invites us to be considerably more flexible, embracing forgiveness as a lifestyle, and not just as an occasional blip on the radar screen of our lives. Forgiveness should be as natural to us as breathing. Jesus says, a reality so comfortable and natural that we aren't even aware of how often we do it. It's a rule, not an exception. That, after all, is what God is like toward us. Totally forgiving. And that's the standard we should aim for toward those who share our common humanity. Our spiritual health and the spiritual health of our church depends on it. And perhaps not surprisingly, our physical and mental health depend on it as well. The New England Journal of Medicine reported many years ago now that people who are unforgiving are significantly more susceptible to a variety of illnesses than their more tolerant and forgiving counterparts. Unresolved anger, resentment, and hostility can and do place our overall well-being at risk. So, on a variety of fronts then, we can agree that the habit of forgiveness is good for us. At least one of the ways we get messed up about it, though, is in thinking that forgiveness is something that we can accomplish all on our own. But in fact, forgiveness and reconciliation best take place in the context of relationship. It's not a decision we make, but rather a change of heart, a healing that we recognize and celebrate. If we think on an international level, the commitment to conversation is working in South Africa in the aftermath of apartheid. And it's working in the truth and reconciliation work being done between the churches and the First Nations peoples whose lives were impacted by experiences in residential schools. Great wrongs, great systemic misunderstandings often need to be aired in the context of relationship if forgiveness is going to be possible. Because, as I said, forgiveness implies a change of heart, not just a change of mind. It's a change in the way we look on another. It's the ability to look with love on another person and see them through the eyes of God, who knows us and forgives us without measuring and expects the same from us. When I was thinking about this, I remembered something I witnessed many years ago. A friend of mine, a very organized and competent person, offered to convene a parish fundraising dinner after the previous convener had stepped away from doing it again. The day of the event rolled around and the dinner was going off without a hitch, and she was feeling great about it. That is, until one of the matriarchs of the church approached her at the dinner and in front of a large group of people accused my friend in loud tones of self-righteous indignation of neglecting to set up a ride for her to get to the event, and then walked off before my friend had a chance to respond. Unbeknownst to my friend, it had been the custom that each year someone picked this woman up to bring her to the dinner. But no one had told my friend that this was part of the convener's job to make sure that the ride was looked after. Simple oversight. So on one hand, we had a person who felt slighted because she felt she had been overlooked or forgotten. And on the other hand, we had my friend who was on the receiving end of a very public verbal attack for forgetting something she wasn't even aware of in the first place. When she talked to me about it at the end of the evening, my friend was still shaking with anger and embarrassment at being on the receiving end of an unjustified verbal assault. She didn't really know what to do. But to my great and continuing amazement, the next day in church, when it came time for the passing of the peace, I saw her go straight to the matriarch in question and apologize for not setting up her ride. I have to tell you, I was speechless at the time and have called that situation to mind often since then. because my friend demonstrated that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, reconciliation is more important than being, technically speaking, in the right. And sometimes when feelings are hurt on both sides, and there's the potential for escalation, that's when we play the game of whose feelings are hurt the most. Sometimes the best way out of a conflict is to simply decide not to contribute to it any longer, and to seek a way out of the impasse instead of perpetuating it. Sometimes it just pays to be vulnerable and to swallow a little pride. So I guess what I'm saying here is that while forgiveness is the face of God that we're called to show to the world, the reality is that it takes work. It takes a commitment to relationship, a commitment to invest whatever time and effort it takes to settle differences, to understand, to listen, and to reconcile. We all would probably agree that some of the most difficult conversations we've ever had are with people who are upset or angry with us. And nothing is as upsetting as an attempt to reconcile that is refused by the person you wish to be reconciled with. And realistically, sometimes all we can do is make the attempt. You can only turn your own heart. You can't turn the heart of another. But you have to try. Theologian Paul Tillich said this about forgiveness. Nothing greater can happen to a human being than to be forgiven. For forgiveness means reconciliation in spite of estrangement. It means reunion in spite of hostility. It means acceptance of those who are unacceptable. And it means reception of those who are rejected. I'd like to give homework. And this week, I'd like to challenge you to make peace with someone whose forgiveness you need, or with someone who you need to forgive. As we take that task back out into the world, hear God's voice in this prayer. 7 times, Lord. I think I reached that number by the age of 5, but you kept on forgiving me. 77 times? I easily surpassed that figure before I was old enough to drive, but that didn't stop you. So why am I so reluctant to give a dipper full of water from the river of grace in which I swim to someone else? Have patience with me, Lord, until I learn that forgiveness is not a score I keep, but a life I live, over and over and over, until I lose count.